Thank you, Mark, very much. Not merely thanking today's chairman, but also a former tutorial pupil, which is a great pleasure. And the boy hasn't done bad, has he? I have been asked to give a general introduction to what is clearly the most controversial and confrontational budget we have had, which made a most enormous impact nationally and internationally. One of the most powerful evocations of the budget I know of is in the autobiography of famous American liberal editor William Allen White, who observed a land and budget league campaign, campaign march in London, a huge parade which reduced White and his wife to tears. We felt we were part of something great and beautiful. The underdog had slipped off his leash, and this was the time to howl. Revolution, said White, was in the air. The actual budget speech, as you probably know, 29th of April 1909, was not a success. It was far too long for one thing, but otherwise it was very much a personal triumph for Lloyd George. He paid, I'm afraid, very little heed to what he was told by the Treasury, who he thought were effete and patronising in the main. I'm sure there are not such people in the Treasury now. He largely ignored the permanent secretary, Sir George Murray, whom he regarded as third class, a view, I may say, shared by his school's examiners in Oxford. He tended to bypass official papers. He worked much more with Robert Chalmers, the head of the Inland Revenue, who was very strongly liberal, and also on technical taxation matters with John Bradbury, who later worked with him at the start of the war, inventing the eponymous banknotes, of course. It was very much Lloyd George's own idea, driven through the cabinet in the face of a great deal of criticism. There were a group of fairly right-wing cabinet ministers, Runciman, McKenna, Lulu Harcourt, constantly critical about aspects of Lloyd George's taxation plans. He had support only from a minority, very much so from Winston Churchill, although Churchill, born in Blenheim Palace, wasn't perhaps too keen on land taxes, but Churchill gave him pretty strong support. Haldane, a supporter, and very decisively Asquith, the Prime Minister, who supported Lloyd George and summed up in his favour time and again. Lloyd George handled the bill very well in committee, a very, very long committee stage that dragged on to November. It was vote after vote in which Lloyd George took part. It was very much a personal show. There are not many other ministers intervening to shoulder the burden with Lloyd George in committee. And in the end, as you know, the House of Lords rejected it. Lloyd George had not planned for this, but I think he rejoiced by then in the fact that they had finally done something so incredibly foolish and provoked a confrontation. It led, as you know, to a great campaign in the country by the Budget League, to two narrow election victories, the passage of the 1911 Parliament Act, very much the high point of Lloyd George's pre-war career, followed shortly afterwards by another great triumph, the passage of national insurance. So it marked Lloyd George out as the dominant figure of the time, the indispensable figure in the government linking the old liberalism and the new. And his irreplaceability was confirmed the next year, 1912, in the minor peccadilloes of the Marconi case, when Asquith and his colleagues simply said, we cannot let Lloyd George go, we cannot govern without him. His background in finance, LG, was very limited. wasn't unique amongst politicians. They were not trained in economics, particularly at that period. It was said later on by one of his secretaries that Lloyd George saw figures from a buoyant and romantic angle. He spoke very little about finance in the 1906 election, when his ideas were pretty conventional, I think, at that stage. But he did develop a growing interest in financial matters when he became president of the Board of Trade, where he served until April 1908, when he became Chancellor. It's a very important time in Lloyd George's career, and still, I think, worth a good deal of scholarly attention. He worked closely with business on measures like the Patents Act. He worked very closely with the trade unions. One of the people he came across when at the Board of Trade is a man called George Paish, became a famous writer on statistical matters and on trade matters, very strongly liberal, and he was to work with Lloyd George really after the budget. I think their collaboration began seriously in the summer of 1909. Paish was a very optimistic man. He believed in overseas investment, he believed in trade, he believed that the economy was going well. So just the kind of chap that Lloyd George liked to discuss matters with. And he certainly boosted Lloyd George's self-confidence, never a particularly feeble attribute, boosted his self-confidence considerably. Paish worked as an official advisor, I may say, with Lloyd George at the start of the war, dealing with a crisis in the currency then. And it is interesting, I think, the way that Paish, so to speak, fed ideas into the directions that Lloyd George's thoughts wanted to follow. But it is an extraordinary display, I think, of self-confidence from someone who had no background in finance but proved himself to be a master of his craft, at least as a politician dealing in finance. It was a highly political exercise. We're talking about the most political chancellor perhaps there ever has been, and that's saying something. He was not afraid of, at every stage, drawing in the political implications. He was not desk-bound. He spent a great deal of time up and about, particularly being up and about on Walton Heath Golf Course. Golf Course was a great arena, as you probably know, for the Edwardians for discussing political matters, and he discussed matters there with journalists like Riddell, the owner of the News of the World, and Robert Donald, people like that. There was a great interrelationship between Lloyd George's conversations and what subsequently appeared. You could, as it were, call it spin. The other major political aid for him, I think, was actually not his financial secretary, Hobhouse, who was a very traditional figure, but C.F.G. Masterman, whose son is actually still alive, dear Neville, born in 1912. I shared a room with him when I went to Swansea, and he's still alive, must be now, work it out, 97. And I still receive letters from him telling me where the Labour Party is going wrong. And Masterman Senior, CFG, a very important political aid for Lloyd George, marrying expertise in land taxes with a social conscience. It's very interesting that Masterman's boss, he worked actually as a junior minister of the local government board. He wasn't in the Treasury. His boss was John Burns, who was a bitter enemy of Lloyd George. So it's a very interesting political configuration that Burns, a junior minister, was perhaps Lloyd George's most important aide. But a very political exercise. Lloyd George, throughout acting as the voice of social reform, the ideas on social reform that had perhaps begun with Asquith's budget of 1907, which is a pretty radical one. Commitment to social reform, commitment also to national development, the kind of themes that Lloyd George had picked up at the Board of Trade, the need to regenerate transport, the need to deal with employment, the need to deal with agriculture, hence the development fund that was created in the budget. And how would it be paid for? It would be paid for by what Lloyd George called democratic finance. By implication, we hadn't had too much of that prior to LG. He was swayed, I think, then, as always throughout his career, by major political ideas. He distinguished, as other liberals did, between the productive and non-productive groups in society. Amongst the non-productive, no prizes for guessing, landowners, who were regarded very widely by liberals like Lloyd George as uncreative, not to say parasitical. Hence the importance of land reform, hence the importance of land taxes, which should be paid for by the landowners who drew the profit, not by the occupiers. Lloyd George's views on the land had always been very radical. Two of his earliest mentors in politics in Wales had been very, very strong land reformers, not to say land nationalisers. A man called Michael Daniel Jones, a famous independent minister who hated landowners in Wales so much he wanted to transplant a lot of Welshmen as far away from them as possible, and he put some in Patagonia, where, as a matter of fact, they still are. For example, places in Patagonia called, for example, Puerto Madryn are named after Welsh towns. Another man with a wonderful name of Pan Jones, editor of a newspaper called The Celt. He was a land nationaliser. The Celts propounded what I think would be recognised as pure socialism at the time, and he was an influence on LG. So there was that theme. Lloyd George had grown up regarding landowners as parasitical and socially objectionable. Land taxes were therefore socially progressive, as well as, he believed, financially productive. Land taxes were a function of civic democracy, and in the context of the day, they were a vindication of free trade. The tariff reformers said the foreigner would pay for social reform, to which Lloyd George replied the rich would pay, and there were plenty of them in Edwardian England. The background is, I think, quite well known to the budget. Firstly, I won't elaborate this, I think it's very well known, there was a big financial deficit, £16 million, doesn't sound much now, but it was a terrifying figure in those days, and this had to be met by new taxes. The biggest item was old age pensions. They had been set up, I may say, with the most appallingly incompetent way by Asquith, who hugely underestimated the cost of old age pensions. And also it emerged, and perhaps Professor Jackson will tell us about this, there seem to be a lot of pensioners in Ireland. They sort of pop out of the hedgerows. There are many more pensioners in Ireland than people had calculated, and that, plus the dreadnought battleships, plus already a deficit in the finances, meant that something had to be done financially. Rather more technical things. Secondly, there was a problem of local government finance. And Lloyd George mentions this in the budget. There were pressures on local authorities, arguments about the rise in the rate in major cities, discussions of new strategy such as site value rating, the rating of site values in municipalities. And this was an ongoing theme, including in the budget. One particular personal and political thing was that the issue of local authority finance, of course, fell under the local government board. which was in the hold, you might say, the stranglehold of John Burns, and there was a good deal of effort necessary, it was felt by Lloyd George, to extract this theme from the local government board control. And this actually continues, and a central issue in the, on the whole, unsuccessful budget of 1914 was rate support grants for hard-pressed local authorities. And of course, there was thirdly a political background factor. The need, of course, for the Liberals to fight back. They'd been doing badly. They'd been humiliated by the unelected House of Lords on issue after issue. They had done badly in by-elections, culminating in the defeat of Winston Churchill in Manchester. The élan, the momentum of 1906 appeared to have gone, and it had to be recaptured. And in the view of Lloyd George, recaptured by bold means. As someone once said, I forget who it was, we are at our best when we are boldest. Wider strategic issue too. Fear of labour. The Liberals were capitalists. They did not want socialism. They were afraid of what had happened to Liberals on the continent. Lloyd George mentioned this many times, afraid of labour, and therefore a good deal of effort made by Lloyd George to appeal to labour during the budget controversy. The Liberals, he says, are the party of cheap food, of full employment. And he made a number of observations, or at least rhetorical concessions, when he talked about land valuation to labour views on the evils of rent and the need to tax rent. Fear of the Unionists. I'm sure Professor Trentman will discuss this, but there was tariff reform, the need for a free trade budget. The Unionists were fighting back. Tariff reform had seemed a popular creed, particularly in 1907 when there was rising unemployment. Things were better at the time of the budget, actually, but clearly the Unionist threat politically and the tariff reform threat was something with which Lloyd George had to deal. I think it's also a very personal thing to keep up radical momentum. Lloyd George had a very, very important visit to Germany, August, September 1908. It's very interesting to me as a student of Lloyd George's career to try to contrast his visit to Germany in 1908 with a rather different visit to Germany in 1936 when he met Hitler. And in a way, these are kind of parameters of his career, I think. He was very interested in social legislation in Germany and insurance, invalidity pensions, very interested also in taxation. He heard about the Frankfurt tax, where in that city there was a tax on the unearned increment of land. He came back, fired with enthusiasm, and spent much of his time in the winter talking with socially radical liberals, Masterman, Rufus Isaacs, and also I think one should include certainly Winston Churchill at this period, backed up by a good deal of PR afterwards. It was all very, very public, all very, very political. Once Lloyd George came back from Germany, stories began mysteriously to multiply in the press that something pretty special was coming up. Something pretty radical would have to be done. And this was the background of the budget. My colleagues, I take it, will be talking in detail about the contents of the budget. But just to itemize them, land taxes. It was recognized that land taxes would not probably be very productive in the short or the medium term. Particularly the tax on the unearned increment is a 20% tax in the budget of 1909. There were huge problems about the valuation of land, which in many ways was the key, I think, to the whole argument, how you valued land, how, for example, you distinguish between land set aside for agriculture and other kinds of land. And what happened was there were all sorts of difficulties. A landowners' body called the Land Union challenged the taxes and the courts repeatedly. But the important thing in Lloyd George's view was that you had land valuation set down in statute. It was there in the budget, in a finance bill, that there would be a valuation of the land as it stood actually back on, I think, April the 30th, 1909. So it could be a retrospective valuation. Lloyd George is very anxious to flag this up, to indicate that this was going to be a big source of revenue for the Liberals. And he rather encouraged his colleagues in a way I cannot believe the chancellors do now, by encouraging them really to spend as much as possible. There were various ministers who submitted their estimates for the following year in the spring of 1909, and Lloyd George is saying in effect, well, you can do better than this. This isn't big enough. We're going to have these land taxes, and we absolutely have to spell out the essential necessity for them. So much a land tax, direct taxes, big increases in income tax and in super tax built on the redistributive and differentiated aspects of Asquith's budget of 1907, and these were actually far, far more successful part of the budget. They gave Lloyd George and colleagues an opportunity to discriminate, to contrast parasitical landowners and license owners in public houses with the industrial classes of capital and of labour. It was all very carefully worked out. They had a fairly good idea of who voted Liberal, and you will find that the existing rates of taxes were broadly held down on incomes below £3,000, and it was really some way above that when super tax in particular began to bite. But it was a major. There's one other factor which is interesting. Family or children's allowances were developed for the first time in 1909, and there was an allowance for people earning under, I think, £500 to have an allowance. It was a principle that became permanent. It was doubled. The allowance was doubled in Lloyd George's budget of 1914. Clearly then a person with children who earned not an enormous amount was on balance going to benefit from the budget. For the working class, the impact, I believe, was fairly neutral, although people didn't like taxes on tobacco or taxes on beer, which it was thought was attacking two of the basic pleasures of the working man. Then there were other kinds of taxes, much higher death duties, much higher stamp duties, higher excise duties on tobacco, as I've said, spirits and licenses, all very successful, not all popular, not least in Ireland, who didn't like duties on things like whiskey and other basic commodities. Also a novelty, the first road fund, the first petrol duty, quite a big one, I think, but it's 3 pence a gallon for road for motorists. And the idea, of course, being that this tax would be hypothecated and devoted to the improvement of roads, or we know what happened to that. But it all added up to a swinging array of taxes, and Punch depicted Lloyd George as John Knox in the pulpit, denouncing motorists, golfers, and all those miserable sinners who happen to own anything. He was certainly not averse to sounding the clarion call of class war. For for example, when he dealt with colossal scorn with the game laws and the game preserves maintained by landowners. And in this connection, it might be just worth mentioning something where I was asked to say very, very briefly something about, since it doesn't appear otherwise on the programme, namely the views of Labour. Labour had reservations over aspects of free trade, which was, after all, generating, or had been generating, higher unemployment and instability. Labour didn't like the taxes, as I've said, on tobacco and on beer. However, the budget was undoubtedly very, very popular with the Labour Party. They even were disposed on occasion to call it the first socialist budget. I certainly don't think it was that, but it was very popular with the Labour Party. It's probably the closest phase of Lib-Lab cooperation before the war. It helped, I think, that the chairman of the Labour Party was Arthur Henderson, a former Liberal, and he spoke with terms of extreme enthusiasm for the budget. And you get even people as distinctly on the left as Keir Hardie lining up to support the budget. The rest is very well known: the clash with the House of Lords, speeches at Limehouse and Newcastle, very, very powerful pieces of popular oratory, drawing protests from the King Edward VII, who said that ministers shouldn't really talk like that about their opponents, and leading to one of these classic confrontations. One of the things that interests me, and not only for this period, is the role of memory and mythology and the competing narratives you see in terms of historical memory, or perhaps myth, are interesting. The free traders, of course, using the historical memories alleged of the Hungry 40s and the poverty that was said to have existed then. Lloyd George turning very strongly onto the theme of landlord power and its anti-democratic implications. He made a famous speech during the campaign relating to the eviction of tenants by landlords in Wales in 1868 for having voted Liberal. It awoke, said Lloyd George, the spirit of the mountains, the genius of freedom that fought the might of the Normans. The political power of landlordism in Wales was shattered as effectively as the power of the Druids. I mention that because I think Lloyd George was a bit unfair to Druids, actually, though I declare interest because I actually am a Druid, and I think that they might be defended. The long-term impact of the budget, finally, obviously colossal. It was used in a way that budgets hadn't been used before, to finance welfare, to finance national development. It was radical. It was redistributive. It introduced and made permanent new principles of public taxation, graduated, differentiated income tax used imaginatively as never before. It was very, very successful. By 1912, Lloyd George could declare a record surplus of £6.5 million. Everything was going fine, founded, interestingly, among other things, on higher public spending and public investment. All future budgets built on this. That really is the end of the story, but I conclude with the great irony. The most contested issue, the one that aroused the most passion in 1909, were, of course, the land duties. They yielded very little. The most valuable feature of them, Lloyd George came to acknowledge, was the valuation exercise to try to form a clear statistical base on which taxation should be founded. Landlords were successful in resisting. It was enormously complicated. One of the things that appeared to have suffered was the housing program, and Lloyd George's great lieutenant and ally, Christopher Addison, found this a problem in 1919 when he started the first program of publicly maintained council housing. So in 1920, the budget quietly abolished Lloyd George's land taxes. They were yielding very little. They simply weren't worth the trouble. The Prime Minister in 1920 was, of course, David Lloyd George. As my old mentor, Alan Taylor, used to say, that truly is one of history's curious twists.